starting from, which in theory shouldn't have a problem, but it's somewhat common for them to have some kind of issue that goes unnoticed until after the mastering happens. And then, like as I mentioned, it's not like I can just pop in the new file and 2 minutes later it's the same. Mm-hmm. It can get grueling to redo a mix. So I think that's my number one piece of advice is listen to the mix that you're sending in. Don't just assume that the file's going to be fine if you export it from your DAW. Most times it will, but sometimes it's not. And just kind of communicate about the process. It's not uncommon for me to receive mixes that are like already limited and reduced to 16-bit. And the limiting is subjective because maybe that's how the mix needs to be and you either work with that or decline the project. But when I see a file that's reduced to 16-bit, I'm like, I'll bet you that whoever mixed this thought they were mastering it, and that's why it's reduced to 16-bit. And I bet you that's why there's limiting on here. And I bet you if the client said to their mix person, can you send me mixes for mastering, that A, they wouldn't have the limiting or at least less, and then they'd be 24-bit, and then usually it's a higher sample rate too. So my point is sometimes I get mixes to work from that are 16-bit 44.1. And I'm not saying that's bad I'm not saying it's bad or wrong, but it's usually a clue that like some communication breakdown happened. Like,
right. Yeah,
and
totally.
Quite often it's like, oh yeah, sometimes it'll be someone I know mixed it. I'll ask them and be like, oh, they never told me it was getting mastered. So here's the better files for mastering from. So communication is huge. Let your mix engineer know that you're going to be mastering elsewhere. And if you're mixing it yourself, if you are doing some limiting, I really like getting those versions with limiting so I can hear how loud people are used to hearing the song. But then I also like to start with a version without limiting. And you don't have to remove every plugin on your master bus, but it's the limiting that really paints things into a corner as far as like what I can do or what anybody could do. And then if you're going to vinyl, you can cut vinyl from a limited master, but it's usually some compromises are involved. So if your project is going to vinyl, you certainly want to supply, unlimited mixes for the person to start from so that you're not painted into that corner.
Those are really good pieces of advice. You got to start telling your clients like, hey, did you listen to this song before you sent it to me?
Yeah.
Is it 100%? Like, some sort of like checklist or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And some of that article is redundant on my website. And that's kind of why I write a lot of these articles. I find if I'm writing the same email over and over, I'm like, maybe it's time to turn this into an article because it seems to be. But yeah, listening to it, you want to keep the resolution as high as possible for as long as possible. So, if you're mixing at 48K, that's great. There's no best sample rate. Some amazing records have been made at 44.1. I don't have a preferred sample rate, but I do prefer that you don't change the sample rate when you're setting it off. So if you're mixing at 44.1, don't upsample it to 96 or 192 because that can actually do damage, especially like, most DAWs like Pro Tools and Logic, the sample rate conversion is not amazing. So you don't want to be changing the sample rate, but you do want to save it at the highest bit depth that it allows because there's a really bit point of confusion here. When you start a Pro Tools session or Logic, it usually asks you the bit depth, right? Like what sample rate and what bit depth do you want to work at? And maybe you choose 24. Maybe you accidentally choose 16 and it's too late to, you've already made a lot of progress. Yeah. That happens.
My first record was 16.
It's not the end of the world. In fact, it's not going to ruin a song, that's for sure. But what a lot of people don't realize is that as soon as you start mixing in the DAW, the mixer works at floating point bit depth. So even if you accidentally record it at 16-bit, fine. You don't need to start over unless you really want to, but I wouldn't, especially if you have a great performance. But even if you set it to 24-bit, the DAW is working at 32-bit floating point, or some are even 64-bit floating point now. So that's the best practice for exporting your mix. So you want to do the highest bit depth that it allows, and then the same sample rate. Logic was the last big one I know of to be slow about floating point exports. Like for the longest time, you could only export, or they call it bounce, 24-bit mixes. And I think only within the last year or two they made it so you can do 32-bit float bounces. When you're done with the song.
I'm a Logic user and I haven't even ever exported a 32-bit, so I'm gonna go see if I can do that.
Yeah. Again, if you're using if your version's a year or two old, it might not have that yet. But the concept is, so there's a free plugin called Bitter, and the company is Stillwell. So if you just Google Stillwell and Bitter, there's a free plugin you can put, or you can download. It's free, because who's going to pay for a bit depth meter? I mean, that's like the nerdiest plugin of all time. But so it's free, but you put it at the end of your master fader, and assuming you're not dithering, if you have a limiter with a dither set to 24 or 16, this doesn't work. But make sure there's no dithering limiter or anything before it. Even though you've recorded at 16 or 24 bit, you're going to see that the bit depth of the audio is floating point, because that's what the mixer is working at. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, is when you're ready to export, it's not going to ruin your mix if you export at 24 bit, but for best practices, there is information above 24 bit, in the floating point range. So put the bit depth meter on there to show you what happens, because here's another way to look at it. If you load in a 24-bit file to your mixing session and you don't do any changes, like you keep it at 0, no panning, no effects, nothing, the bit depth meter will read 24-bit. As soon as you change the gain even a fraction of a decibel, or you insert a plug-in and change the EQ, any little digital change, all of a sudden it's floating point again.
Right.
And that's where there's advantage to saving your bounce at floating point, because there is information there. Whether or not it's audible is debatable, but I'm a fan of best practices. Like, if the information's there, I say keep it until
gives you a better noise floor.
Yeah, keep it until it eventually it will get discarded, because when I make my final masters, they're 24-bit or 16, but it's there. And the place that it can really be helpful is with headroom, because floating point audio allows for levels over 0 dB. So let's say you're mixing a song in the box, and you know how mix creep happens, where like you start low, but eventually you turn this up, that up. Suddenly the snare hits in the third chorus are clipping the master fader. Right. Which with 24-bit audio could be a big deal, because you can't have values over 0, right? So it's just going to clip off that peak and it's gone forever. So the solution would be like turn down some faders so it doesn't do that, which can be dangerous because you can screw up your mix if you're not careful when you do that. If you turn down all your faders and the effects are like post fader, you're turning the effects down twice, kind of. But my whole point is, if you have a mix where there's a few overs, you don't really have to worry about it. If you're sending it off to mastering, you can just save the mix as floating point, and then the mastering engineer, when they turn it down, all those peaks will actually be there.
Damn, I had no idea about that. That's insane.
I have an article, another Pro Audio, how do you say that? Pro Audiophiles article. That's a tongue twister. I have a Pro Audiophiles article called, the 6 dB headroom myth, or the -6 dB headroom myth, because people are always like, what level should I send to mastering? And then someone's always like, -6. It's got to be -6. And then people stress out about that. And it honestly doesn't matter the level, as long as there's not a limiter. And if you save it as floating point, I've had mixes that clip like, it'll read like +10 on some of the loudest parts. And I can turn it down and all the peaks are still there because they saved it as floating point and they didn't have a limiter on it. And a lot of people don't understand this yet. It's kind of, I want to say it's new, but it's kind of weird. I did a single last week where the mix engineer is like, here's a mix with my limiting that I had on for the artist to approve. And then here's a mix. It has a limiter, but he's like, I don't have it adding any gain, but I just wanted to catch a few peaks that are going over. And I was like, wait, don't do that. Just take the limiter off completely. I know it's going to seem weird. Take the limiter off, go naked, save the mix as floating point, and all the peaks are actually going to be there. They won't be cut off from a limiter or the nature of 24-bit audio, and it makes for a better starting point. So that's really where floating point can come in handy, is if you're in the box mix is getting kind of hot and has some, it's going to look scary because the master fader might say it clipped. And it might even sound crunchy coming out of your interface, but from a mathematical standpoint in the box, it's actually fine. My point is, with that article, I have a GIF where I show a mix that looks like badly clipped before I started with it, but since it was saved as floating point, it shows me turning down the waveform in RX, and instead of looking like a chopped off mix that gets turned down, all the peaks, the natural peaks come back. It makes for a great starting point. So
that's wild.
That's an advantage to floating point. So that's why I say save it at the same sample rate, but at the highest bit depth, because the least that it can do is maybe preserve a little bit of like low level detail, reverb tails. Yeah. The best that
I always found that you can hear the difference between a 24-bit and a 16-bit wave, and like you do lose some of that that detail under there.
Yeah.
And
So
when you convert it to 16.
yeah. So keep everything as high as you can until let the mastering engineer deal with final formats and conversions.
Right. That's their job.
But part of the problem is people don't realize that when they accidentally record at 16 or even when they record at 24-bit, you're not mixing in 24-bit. You're mixing in floating point. And I think it's because of how programs are set up. I think they set up to confuse you because when you start your session, that's what you choose. You choose 24-bit, 16, or 16-bit. But that's really just for recorded audio. I mean, interfaces are, for the most part, still 24-bit. So it doesn't make sense to record any higher than 24-bit. But just be aware when you export your mixes that they are floating point. And if you're the kind of person that records your mixes back to a new track, then you got to be careful because if your record settings are 24-bit, then that's not – everything I just talked about is not going to help you because it's recording a 24-bit file back into the session. There's some people I don't know if you are familiar with that, where some people – instead of bounce to disk, they'll record back to a new track.
Sure.
Years ago, there was a big debate on the forums about which sounded better. Someone's like, bounce to disk sounds worse. You got to print it back to a new track in your session and then export it. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but the floating point thing only works if you bounce it to that or if your record settings are like that. So I'm getting kind of lost in the weeds, but that's kind of my main tip there for mixing yourself is...
No, it's a good tip. I like it.
Keep the
I'll often just put like a gain plugin at the end of a mix. I mean, because I've never done this before, but like I'll just put like a gain plugin when I take off the limiter. I'll just take everything down by like a few dB, so just to make sure that there's no transients hitting zero.
Yeah, that can work, but it's also perhaps unnecessary if you save it as floating point. But if you're if it doesn't work if you're doing the mastering, that obviously is not going to work because it has to be 24-bit or 16 at some point. It's just a little tip this mix sounded amazing. This was like a really good mix engineer, right? But he's like, I left the limiter on, but kept the threshold at 0 just to catch a few, what did he call them? A few...
stray.
Yeah, he had a funny word for it. He called them crimes. He's like, there's a couple crimes, in the song. So I just left this limiter on as a safety net. And it's like, I kind of get the logic behind that, but better off just, like I said, take it off and save it as floating point, and then... That's the best, and then all the peaks are really there.
Yeah. Well, Justin, we've covered so much, and it's getting late here, so I just do want to wrap up because I don't want to go all day. But I do have a few more questions that I just don't think I'm going to get to. So maybe I'll have to ask you another time or on another episode. But we've touched on so many things, and actually I've learned a ton. So I'll just ask you a couple more questions before we wrap up. But and these are just kind of general questions that I ask everybody. The first of which is, we all kind of have days where we're, obviously pumped to be in the studio, but we also have days where we're not as pumped. What do you do on those days when you're not feeling it as much? How do you get in the zone?
Well, one nice thing with mastering is I can kind of pick my own schedule. So if I'm really not feeling it, there's always some administrative work to do or website work, catching up on emails, maybe taking a walk. But then usually... once I start doing that, I'll get an email and that really sparks me like, okay, this project I sent out, they love it, but there's one little change. And I'm like excited to go in and make that change. And then all of a sudden I'm in work mode again. So it does happen occasionally where I'm like just kind of procrastinating on getting in the studio or not, sometimes I'm still not even dressed yet. I'm just, being lazy. And then I get that one email that says, okay, we got to do this revision, get in there and do it. And that fires me up. But I think, if you have your own business, it's easy to plan days of like, I'm only going to answer emails. I'm going to catch up on some website updates I've been meaning to do or little stuff like that. So I guess, but luckily for me, it doesn't happen too often or I need to think about that. But those are some things that have come up.
Nice. And so this is just a question I've asked everybody on the show, and so I'm sure you're expecting it. But so looking back on your journey, in audio, was there something that you either did or didn't do at the beginning of your career, either knowing it or not knowing it, that you thought was an important learning piece for somebody who's maybe more at the beginning of their journey? This was something that I did right or something I did wrong that you'd want to impart on them.
I think, when I was starting, just saying yes to literally everything. I mean, I recorded so many albums that I'm not proud of, whether it's the content or the job I did, but they're all learning experiences. So, I mean, if you record 100 terrible albums, you'll be ready for that project 101 that's like an amazing band that's going to like get you more work because then someone's going to hear that and be like, I want to work with that person. So, I mean, when you're starting out, I mean, you just got to be ready to say yes to everything. I've said yes to things I had no